In the last week of October 1888, the stage office at Fort Sumner smelled of wet wool, lamp oil, and coffee, boiled so long that it had turned bitter enough to strip varnish. Clara Vance stood beside the ticket window, with one gloved hand around the handle of her traveling case and the other pressed flat against the folded contract in her coat pocket. The paper promised her a schoolroom, $32 a month, and a room behind the widow Ortega's kitchen in the settlement of San Aurelio. It did not promise that the roof would hold, that the children would arrive in shoes, or that anyone in town wanted an unmarried teacher from Massachusetts telling their sons how to read. Those omissions did not trouble her as much as the sky. Through the office window, clouds had lowered over the plain until the distant mesas seemed to carry a lid of hammered lead. A fine white grit had begun to blow across the yard. It was too early for snow in that part of New Mexico territory, and the station master kept saying so as though repetition might persuade the weather to behave. October dust, he told anyone who looked outside. Nothing more. Elias Coe, the stage driver, came in stamping ice from his boots. He was a narrow man in a buffalo coat gone shiny at the elbows, with a gray beard that held 3 frozen drops. He set his gloves near the stove and looked at Clara's small case, then at the larger trunk already tied behind the coach. "You got anything in that trunk you can't live without?" he asked. "My books," he grunted. "Then I advise living." The station master laughed, but Elias did not. He lifted the coffee pot, sniffed it, and put it back without pouring. "The pass is open?" Clara asked. "It was at noon." That sounds like an answer designed not to answer. Elias glanced at her, and the corner of his mouth moved beneath his beard. "You teach grammar and history." History is mostly weather and men claiming they planned for it. Outside, one of the wheel horses struck the ground and shook its harness. The brass rings made a nervous high music. Elias moved to the window. For a moment he watched the northern ridge, where a gray veil had begun to spill between the peaks. "We leave now," he said. "Or we stay 3 days, maybe 4. The station master objected. He had mail contracts, schedules, and a ledger full of promises made in ink. Elias let him speak, then put on his gloves. Clara had spent 6 weeks traveling west by train and coach, crossing country that seemed to become larger each day and less interested in human intention. She had already delayed twice. San Aurelio's school term had begun without her. The widow Ortega had sent a second letter, written in careful Spanish-accented English, saying the children were waiting and that the little stove smoked but could be managed if one opened the east window. "I'll go," Clara said. Elias looked at her contract pocket as if he could see through the cloth. "That paper won't keep you warm." "No, but it will still be there after the weather passes." He studied her a moment longer. "Get in, then." There were no other passengers. A cattle buyer had changed his mind after seeing the clouds, and a drummer selling patent medicines claimed his liver warned him against travel. Clara took the rear-facing seat, arranged her skirts, and placed her satchel beside her. It held 2 clean blouses, a hairbrush, a family photograph, 3 letters, a small tin of tea, and the silver watch her father had carried for 27 years. The watch had stopped on the morning of his funeral. She had never had it repaired. Elias climbed to the box. The brake released with a groan. Leather tightened, traces snapped, and the Concord coach rolled out of the yard beneath a sky that seemed to be sinking. For the first hour, the road remained visible. It ran pale and rutted through rabbit brush and black grama grass, bending toward a line of juniper-dark hills. Clara tried to read, but the coach pitched too sharply. She closed the book and watched the country pass through the wavering glass. The west had looked clean from the train. Immense distances, bright air, mountains blue as enamel. Up close, it was full of small brutalities. Fence wire caught scraps of hide. Cattle bones lay in washes. At water stops, women with cracked hands carried buckets while men argued over freight rates. Yet there was beauty everywhere, sudden and uninvited. Sunlight opened in the clouds and turned a red bluff into a glowing wall. A hawk hung over the road without moving its wings. Once, they passed a Navajo family traveling south, their sheep flowing around them like dirty water, and a little girl in a red blanket watched Clara with calm, dark eyes until the coach rounded a bend. By mid-afternoon, the first sleet hit the roof. It sounded like handfuls of seed thrown against tin. Elias called down through the speaking tube, "Put on whatever you've got." Clara pulled a knitted shawl over her shoulders and buttoned her coat to the throat. The temperature dropped with such speed that the inside of the window clouded under her breath. The road became a brown ribbon between streaks of white. Then the wind arrived. The coach leaned on its springs. Harness buckles clanged. Elias shouted to the horses, his voice reduced to scraps by the gale. Clara braced one boot against the opposite seat and gripped the leather strap beside the door. The sleet thickened into snow. Not the patient snow she remembered from New England, falling straight through lamplight and softening fences, but hard grains driven sideways with enough force to sting through seams. Within minutes the land disappeared. The coach moved inside a white roar. The wheels struck stones, dropped into ruts, climbed out again. Each impact traveled through the wooden body and into Clara's spine. She told herself that Elias knew the road. She told herself that the horses knew it. She told herself many things that were true an hour earlier. Up on the box, Elias leaned so far forward that his chest nearly touched his knees. Ice sealed his beard to his collar. The reins had gone stiff in his hands. He could no longer see the leaders, only the dark heave of their bodies when the wind tore a temporary hole in the snow. The trail should have turned south at a split boulder. He had not seen the boulder. He was navigating by the slope beneath the wheels and the remembered pull of the valley. The left wheel dropped, struck, and rose again. "Easy," he shouted. The horses lunged. A shape appeared ahead, juniper or rock, impossible to tell, and vanished. Elias hauled the right rein. The coach slewed sideways. For one long second, the wheels skated over packed snow with no grip beneath them. Then the ground was gone. Clara heard the front axle break before she understood they were falling. The sound was sharp and intimate, like a chair smashed in the next room. Her satchel flew across the compartment. The world tipped. She struck the wall shoulder first, then the ceiling, then something hard enough to fill her mouth with the taste of iron. Wood burst. Glass flashed. The coach rolled once and came to rest at an angle that left Clara crumpled beneath the forward seat. Silence followed. Not true silence, but the stunned absence of the sounds that had mattered. The wheels no longer turned. Elias no longer shouted. One horse screamed twice, farther away each time, and then the storm covered everything. Clara opened her eyes. Snow came through the broken window and dusted the red velvet upholstery. A brass lamp hung crooked from its bracket, unlit. Her left shoulder burned. Blood ran from a cut near her hairline, warm for a few seconds before the cold reached it. She said Elias's name. The coach gave a slow wooden creak in reply. She crawled upward, pushing splinters and a broken valise aside. The door had twisted in its frame. She kicked once, twice, and on the third attempt the lower hinge tore free. Wind burst inside and took her breath. Outside, the wreck lay against a bank of juniper. The rear wheel turned lazily in the air. Mail sacks had split open, scattering envelopes across the snow. One white letter skittered past Clara's boot and vanished into the storm. She found Elias 20 feet downhill. He lay on his back with one arm bent beneath him, half covered already. The driver's box had thrown him clear. A length of rein remained wrapped around his right glove. Clara knelt, removed her glove with her teeth, and pressed 2 fingers beneath his jaw as she had once seen a doctor do. Nothing moved under the skin. His eyes were open. Snow collected in his lashes. Clara touched his coat near the collar, then drew her hand away. There was no speech appropriate to a man dead in a ravine, no sentence from scripture or history that did not feel made for a warmer room. She closed his eyes with her fingertips. "I am sorry," she said. The storm took the words. She forced herself to stand. The horses were gone. The coach could not shelter her. The broken windows faced the wind, and snow was filling the compartment. Her shoulder still moved, though painfully. Her ankle held. She found her satchel under the wreck and looped its strap across her body. From the luggage boot, she pulled a wool lap robe, a box of matches sealed in waxed paper, and Elias's small canteen. The trunk with her books had split open. Pages whipped among the junipers, white upon white. She caught one by instinct. It was from Plutarch, a page about courage. The absurdity of it almost made her laugh. Then, through a thinning in the snow, she saw a cross. It stood black against the northern slope, high and narrow above what might have been a bell tower. The shape disappeared, returned, and disappeared again. Clara remembered Elias pointing out a mission ruin earlier, before the weather turned. Santa Isabel, he had called it, abandoned since the Mexican War, 2 miles off the road, perhaps less. The coach offered no chance. The cross offered a small one. She tucked the loose page inside her coat and began walking. The first 100 yards were merely difficult. After that, distance lost meaning. Snow climbed over her boots and filled them from the top. Her skirts absorbed water until they dragged at her knees. The lap robe caught the wind like a sail, so she wrapped it around her waist and tied it with a torn rein. She kept the cross ahead of her whenever she could see it, but the storm shifted the world. Junipers emerged at arm's length and vanished behind her. Rock outcrops became crouching animals. Once she stepped into a wash hidden by a drift and fell to her hip, sinking so deeply that panic came hot and immediate. She clawed at the bank, found a root, and pulled until the frozen ground tore the skin from her palm. She thought of lying down only after the idea had begun to feel reasonable. It would be quieter close to the ground. The snow would cover the wind. Her father's study appeared in her mind with unnatural clarity. Green curtains, coal popping in the grate, the smell of old bindings and pipe smoke. Her mother bent over a basket of mending. A clock ticked on the mantel. Clara could walk into that room if she stopped fighting the cold long enough. She slapped her own cheek. The pain was distant. "San Aurelio," she said aloud. She pictured the schoolhouse described in the widow's letters: 12 desks, one cracked slate board, a roof patched with flattened kerosene tins, children waiting, a smoking stove and an east window. San Aurelio. She used the name as a step. Each time her boot came free of the snow, she said it again. When the mission walls finally appeared, they did not look like sanctuary. They rose from the storm in broken slabs, pale adobe over stone, their upper edges jagged where weather had eaten them away. The bell tower leaned slightly west. 2 bronze bells hung in its arches, dark and enormous, motionless despite the wind. The main doors were shut beneath a carved lintel blackened by age. Clara stumbled across the courtyard. A low wall guided her hand toward the building. She struck the main door with her shoulder, but it did not move. She tried again and cried out as pain ran down her injured arm. Along the south wall, nearly hidden by drifted snow, a narrow service door stood crooked in its opening. Its lower boards had rotted. Clara kicked through one, reached inside, and found the bar. The wood lifted reluctantly. The door opened 4 inches, then caught on the snow packed behind it. Clara turned sideways, pushed with her back, and squeezed through. The wind stopped. The sudden stillness was so complete that she heard the blood beating in her ears. She fell onto cold flagstones and lay with her face against the floor, breathing dust, damp earth, and something faintly resinous beneath both. Behind her, the door shifted inward and settled against its broken frame. The nave stretched ahead in gray darkness. Roof beams disappeared high above. Rows of ruined pews leaned at odd angles, their wood bleached and split. Saints without faces occupied wall niches. A cracked plaster angel extended one remaining hand over the aisle. Near the altar, an iron stove squatted beneath a pipe that vanished into the shadows. Clara crawled behind a pillar where the wind from the door could not reach her. She wrapped the lap robe around her shoulders and tried to open the matchbox, but her fingers no longer obeyed. One match fell, then another. The third broke between her thumbs. She began to shake so violently that her teeth struck together. It seemed possible that she had reached shelter only to die more privately. A scrape sounded near the side chapel. Clara froze. At first she thought it was a rat moving through plaster. Then came the soft pressure of a boot on grit. A man stepped from behind the remains of a velvet curtain. He was tall, broad through the chest, and dressed in weather-darkened buckskin beneath a wool coat. His hair, tied low at the back of his neck, was black except for one narrow streak of gray near his left temple. A knife hung at his belt, so did a revolver in a worn cavalry holster. Firelight, no, not firelight, only the pale reflection of snow through the windows, caught the planes of his face and the small scar beneath his right ear. Clara knew at once that he was Apache. Every story told in Eastern parlors arrived in her mind together. Raids described by men who had never left Boston, illustrations of burning wagons, warnings given by station agents who sold fear as readily as tickets. She reached among the broken wood beside her and found the end of a pew rail. It was heavy, splintered, and absurd. She raised it with both hands. "Stay where you are." Her voice came out as a cracked whisper. The man stopped. He looked at the piece of wood, then at her face. His expression did not change. He made no movement toward his weapons. For several seconds they regarded one another across the ruined nave, while the storm pressed against the walls. Then he turned his back on her. He crossed to the iron stove, knelt and opened its small door. From an alcove he brought a bundle wrapped in hide. Inside were cedar splints, dry grass, and a twist of sage. He arranged them with unhurried hands, struck flint against steel, and caught a spark in the grass. A flame appeared. It was no larger than a coin. Yet Clara watched it as though the sun had risen inside the church. The man fed it cedar. Resin snapped. The flame climbed, throwing orange light over his knuckles and the iron door. Smoke moved into the pipe. Heat began slowly, almost imperceptibly, to gather around the stove. He stood, carried his gear to the far side of the nave, and sat with his back against a column. He left the whole circle of warmth empty for her. Clara's arms failed. The broken rail fell and struck the floor. The man did not look up. She crawled toward the fire. The warmth hurt before it helped. As Clara held her hands toward the stove, pain returned in bright needles. Her fingertips burned. Her feet throbbed inside wet boots. The cut at her temple began to pulse with each beat of her heart. She clenched her jaw to keep from crying out, but a small sound escaped her anyway. The man across the nave lifted his head. He waited until she stopped trying to hide the pain, then rose. Clara's hand went instinctively toward the broken pew rail, though it lay beyond her reach. He paused, saw the movement, and pointed first to her bleeding temple, then to a leather pouch in his hand. "No," she said. He remained still. Clara pressed the heel of her palm against the cut. Her glove came away dark. She had no mirror. But the blood running beside her ear told her what pride refused to admit. "What is in the pouch?" The question was foolish. He might not understand a word. He opened it and showed her folded linen, small bone needle, a wooden box of salve, and dried leaves tied with thread. Then he set the pouch on the floor halfway between them and stepped back. Clara stared at it. The stove ticked as the iron expanded. Meltwater ran from her hem and formed a black crescent on the stone. She reached for the pouch. The salve smelled of pine pitch, rendered fat and bitter herbs. She dabbed it near the wound and nearly dropped the box when it stung. The man watched from a respectful distance, then made a small circling motion near his own temple. Clean first. Clara understood. She had taught children who spoke little English. Meaning often lived in hands before it lived in words. The man filled a dented pot with snow from a drift inside the door and set it on the stove. When the water warmed, he poured some into a tin cup and placed it beside her. She washed the cut with the linen. The cloth came away red and gritty. Her fingers shook too badly to bind it. He pointed to the bandage, then to her head, asking permission without speech. Clara closed her eyes once. All right? His hands were careful. He smelled of snow, smoke, leather, and horse. He wrapped the linen around her brow, drew it snug, and tied the knot above her left ear to keep pressure off the wound. He did not touch her, more than the work required. When he finished, he returned to his place. Clara looked at the bandage ends in her lap. Thank you. He inclined his head. The word had reached him. For a while they listened to the fire. The storm entered the church through every crack as sound. A low push beneath the doors, a whistle in the bell tower, a dry hiss of snow against the high windows. Now and then a rafter groaned. Dust sifted down in thin veils. The man removed his wool coat and hung it near the stove. Beneath it he wore a patched cavalry shirt, faded blue, with the brass buttons cut away and replaced by horn. The sleeves had been shortened. On his left forearm, pale scars crossed one another beneath the skin. He took a strip of dried meat from his pack, warmed it on the stove lid, and cut it in two. He slid the larger piece toward Clara. She had not realized how hungry she was until the smell reached her. The meat was tough, salty, and smoked with mesquite. She chewed slowly while he ate the smaller portion. The water tasted of iron from the cup. It was the best thing she had ever drunk. After the shaking eased, she removed her boots. Her stockings were soaked, and one heel had rubbed raw. The man tossed her a pair of dry wool wrappings from his pack. Clara hesitated before using them. They were clean but mended many times, the edges soft with wear. She turned her back, changed beneath her skirts, and hung the stockings over a broken pew near the stove. The ordinary modesty of the act steadied her. Wet stockings, aching toes, a cup placed upside down to dry. Such small matters belonged to life. Dead people did not worry about whether a stranger saw their ankles. The man had begun examining the room. He checked the stovepipe joints, packed a leak with clay from a small jar, and tested the bar across the side door. At the main entrance, he laid his palm against the timber as though reading pressure through it. His stillness was not passivity. It was attention sharpened into habit. Clara watched him return to the fire. My name is Clara Vance. She touched her chest. Clara. He looked at her. Clara, she repeated. His pronunciation was quiet and exact. Clara. Then he touched his own chest. Taze. She repeated it incorrectly. He said it again, separating the sound into two patient beats. Taze, taze. A hint of approval crossed his face. Nantan? She asked, uncertain where she had heard the name. Perhaps Elias had mentioned a scout who moved through the northern valleys. Perhaps it belonged to another man entirely. Taze's eyes narrowed, not in anger but surprise. Then he nodded. Taze Nantan. He pointed toward the doorway, made the motion of reins in his hands, and looked at her. Stagecoach, Clara said. It overturned. She demonstrated the wheels drop with one hand and turned the other over. The driver died. Taze's gaze shifted toward the storm. Ko? You knew Elias Ko? He lifted one hand level with his shoulder and moved it forward in the manner of a stage traveling the road. Then he tapped 2 fingers against his chest, pointed west, and drew an imaginary pipe from his lips. Clara remembered Elias's abandoned coffee and the faint sweet smell that had clung to his coat. You shared tobacco. Taze nodded. He is in the ravine south of here. For the first time, grief entered Taze's expression openly. It did not twist his features. It lowered them. He placed 2 fingers against the stone, then touched them to his forehead. Clara looked into the stove. He closed the road behind us with his own body. Taze added another stick of cedar to the fire. The knowledge that Elias had been known by someone else changed the shape of his death. He was no longer only a frozen figure beside a ruined coach. He had sat somewhere with Taze and passed a pipe between them. He had perhaps laughed. He had become impatient. He had listened to some story and remembered part of it wrong. A life extended beyond the last place Clara had seen it. I left his canteen, she said, touching it at her side. I can return it when. The sentence ended. When what? When the road opened. When anyone believed her account. When she could find a man who did not live where addresses reached. Taze waved the matter away. He pointed to the canteen and then to her. Keep it. Night came without sunset. The gray windows simply darkened until the fire became the only visible center of the church. Taze lit a small lamp but shielded 3 sides with tin. He seemed unwilling to let light escape through the windows. Clara noticed and asked why. He listened before answering. Men, he said. It was the first English word he had spoken besides names. What men? Taze crossed to the clear patch of floor between the stove and the altar. With a burned cedar stick, he drew a square for the mission, 2 lines for the ridge, and a bent mark for the road. His charcoal moved with confidence. He drew 3 small shapes west of the ridge, each carrying a long rifle. Then he pointed upward. At first Clara thought he meant the roof. He shook his head and led her gaze toward the bell tower. The bells? He nodded. She had seen the bells only through the storm, 2 dark mouths in stone arches. Now, standing beneath them, she could feel their weight in the structure. The larger bell had been cast with raised lettering around its lip. Even from the nave she could make out the irregular green-black of old bronze. Why would armed men want church bells? Taze rubbed thumb and fingers together. Money. For the metal? He nodded, then drew a circle within the larger bell and tapped it 3 times. Hidden. Something inside? He made the motion of lifting a heavy bar, then glittering fingers, silver or gold. Clara had heard such stories at stage stops. Every abandoned mission in the territory seemed to have a lost register, a buried reliquary, or a priest's treasure hidden before an uprising. Men who would not work a week for wages would cross 50 miles of waterless country for a rumor. You think there is treasure in the bell? Taze's mouth tightened with contempt. He shook his head. They think so. Yes, his English was spare but clear when he chose to use it. He drew a military cap in the dust, then 3 men. He touched the faded shirt he wore and pointed to the cap. You served with them? Scout. The word landed hard between them. Clara knew what the newspapers called Apache scouts. Loyal auxiliaries when cavalry needed them. Traitors when the same papers needed a sharper story. She also knew that men who survived between armies often belonged nowhere afterward. Taze drew a line from the cap to the mission. He made the sign for digging, then for a bell being lowered. He added 3 marks beside the ridge. These men were soldiers? Were. Deserters. He nodded. One of the charcoal figures received a narrow vertical line down its face. Taze tapped it, then said Miller. Clara knew the name. Silas Miller had passed through Las Vegas while she waited for a connection, boasting in a hotel dining room about a Spanish cache large enough to buy half the Pecos Valley. He had worn a former cavalry greatcoat with the insignia removed and had tipped the waiter with a coin he later took back during an argument. Clara had thought him merely loud. You followed him here? Taze shook his head. He touched the floor. Before. You were already guarding the mission. He looked toward the bell tower. The question that came to Clara felt too personal, but the storm had stripped away many ordinary boundaries. Why? Taizé sat back on his heels. For a time he did not answer. Then he drew another figure, smaller than himself, wearing a long braid. Beside it he drew a child. He placed both near a row of low hills. Next came a cluster of lines like soldiers' rifles. His hand stopped. He rubbed the two figures away with his palm. Clara's breath tightened. Taizé drew the mission again. He touched the smaller bell, then his chest. My mother heard it, long ago. He searched for words, water, food, no soldiers. The mission had offered sanctuary once, perhaps during a raid or a winter flight. To Taizé, the bells were not Spanish property or church property. They were proof that one place in the valley had once opened its doors. And now you do the same, Clara said. He glanced at her bandage, the wool wrappings on her feet, and the piece of meat she had eaten. Fire is fire. The simplicity of the answer shamed her more effectively than any rebuke. Clara sat beside the map, keeping space between them. My father believed education could make people less cruel. Taizé looked at her, waiting. He had shelves of histories. Greece, Rome, England, our own war. He said ignorance caused men to repeat what came before. She folded her hands. After he died, I found notes in the margins of those books. He had written the same hope beside accounts of 3 different wars. Taizé pushed the charcoal toward her. What? He gestured to the empty stone. Clara took the stick. She drew a square room, small desks, a stove, and an east window. Then she added child figures, some taller than others. School. Taizé watched closely. She drew a line from a distant city to the school. I am going there to teach. Why? No one had asked the question so directly. Clara studied the blackened cedar between her fingers. Because I was no longer needed where I was. Taizé shook his head once. No? He pointed to the contract pocket of her coat, though he could not know what it contained. Then he touched the little schoolhouse drawing. You go because needed there. Clara looked down at the map until the lines blurred. A sharp knock sounded somewhere high in the church. Taizé rose instantly. His hand found the revolver at his hip. The sound came again, metal against stone. He motioned Clara behind the pillar and crossed toward the bell tower stairs. The lamp remained shielded. The stove glow was low, no more than a red seam through the grate. Taizé climbed without a sound. Clara waited, listening to the wind and the quick rhythm of her own breathing. After several minutes, he returned carrying a broken strip of iron. Snow had forced a shutter loose in the belfry. He set the metal down, but his attention remained elsewhere. He went to the south door and crouched near the threshold. When he stood, he held a pinch of snow in his fingers. In it was a black fleck. Ash, Clara understood. Their stovepipe smoke had been pressed downward by the storm and carried along the wall. Anyone close enough might smell cedar or see the dark stain against the snow. Are they near? Taizé listened. At first Clara heard nothing beyond the blizzard. Then, far off and almost swallowed by the wind, came a horse's shrill cry. Taizé closed the stove draft. The fire dimmed. He pointed to Clara, then upward toward the altar loft. You want me to hide? He shook his head. He pointed to himself, then to her, then upward. Together they gathered what could reveal them. Taizé wrapped the tin cup in cloth. Clara took down her stockings, still damp, and pushed them into her satchel. He scattered cold ash over the brighter coals, leaving enough air for the fire to live without shining. The nave fell into a darkness broken only by thin blue light at the windows. Behind the altar, a narrow stair climbed between 2 walls. The steps were uneven and thick with dust. Clara's shoulder protested each time she pulled herself upward. Taizé followed close enough to catch her if she slipped but never touched her. The stair opened into a loft above the sanctuary. Rotten choir screens concealed most of it from below. From there, Clara could see the central aisle, the stove, the pillars, and both doors. A heavy rope hung through a hole in the ceiling and disappeared into the belfry. Taizé crouched beside the screen and pointed along the curved wall. He whispered near the plaster, then motioned for Clara to move to the opposite side. She did. When he breathed her name into the wall, the sound arrived beside her ear as though he stood there. Clara startled. Taizé's expression held the faintest trace of humor. A whispering gallery, she murmured. She had read of such architecture in cathedrals. The curve of the stone carried sound around the nave. He nodded toward the doors. A plan began to take form, not in full but in pieces. Darkness, echo, height, the intruder's fear of a place they wished to violate. The wind shifted. This time the sound below was unmistakable. A rifle butt struck the main door. Once, twice. Then a man shouted through the wood, "Open up! We know somebody's burning cedar in there." Clara recognized Silas Miller's voice. Taizé drew his knife. not to attack but to cut a length from a coil of old bell rope. He handed the cord to Clara, pointed to the loft rail, and showed her how to loop it through a carved opening, a restraint, a snare, a way to move something below without showing herself. Another blow shook the door. A second voice cursed the cold. A third told Miller the south entrance looked rotten. Taze extinguished the shielded lamp. In the darkness, he leaned close enough for Clara to hear him without the wall. "No shot unless no choice," he said. She nodded. Below them, wood split. The south door failed on the third kick. A plank cracked inward. Snow and wind rushed through the opening, carrying 3 men with them in a confusion of boots, rifles, and curses. The first stumbled over the broken threshold and nearly fell. He was thick through the neck, wearing a cavalry coat too small across the shoulders and a red scarf wrapped over his lower face. Behind him came a younger man in a fur cap, followed by Silas Miller. Clara knew Miller before he pushed back his hood. His narrow face had the same hungry sharpness she remembered from the hotel dining room. Ice clung to his mustache. A pale scar ran from his left eyebrow into the hairline, making that eye appear permanently raised in disbelief. "Bar it," he ordered. The thick-necked man forced the broken door shut and wedged a fallen pew beneath the latch. The younger man dropped beside the stove, tore open its door, and swore when ash rolled over his gloves. "Embers," he said. "Somebody was here. Somebody is here," Miller replied. His voice carried upward with ugly clarity. He raised a lantern, but its flame had gone out. He shook it, cursed, and handed it to the younger man. "Finch, get it lit." Joseph Finch's hands shook too badly to work the striker. He could not have been more than 25. His cheeks were raw from wind, and a fringe of blonde beard was frozen into points along his jaw. The thick-necked man, Thorne, Clara guessed, leaned against a pillar and flexed his fingers with a grimace. "No horses," Thorne said. "Lost mine at the lower wash. You let go of the line. The line snapped. Everything snaps around you." Thorne looked at Miller with slow hatred. "You want to say that again when I can feel my hands?" Miller ignored him and walked to the center of the nave. His boots left dark tracks on the stone. "We saw smoke. Come out, and maybe we share the fire." No one answered. Miller smiled without amusement. "Maybe." Taze watched through the choir screen. His breathing remained even. He pointed to Thorne, then made a closing motion with his fist, the dangerous one at close quarters. Finch he marked with 2 fingers trembling, afraid. Miller received a tap near the temple, thinking but not clearly. Below, Finch coaxed the embers alive. A small flame caught on a strip of cloth torn from his shirt. He fed it splinters from a pew, and smoke immediately rolled into the room. "Cedar," he said. "Smell that?" Whoever had the fire used cedar. "Indians," Thorne muttered. Miller's head turned. "One Indian. You know that how? Because Nantan has been shadowing us since Socorro." The name changed the air. Even Thorne glanced toward the dark aisles. Finch stopped feeding the stove. "You said the scout was dead." "I said he should have been. Not the same thing." Miller crossed to him. "He is 1 man. We are 3. We were 5 at Cibola." Thorne's voice was flat. "Barker drowned because you sent him into a flooded shaft. Vale ran when the cavalry patrol found our camp. Vale ran because he was a coward. Vale ran because you shot Barker after the shaft broke his legs." For a moment only the wind spoke. Clara looked at Taze. He had not exaggerated the men below. If anything, his charcoal marks had been mercifully simple. Miller's expression hardened. Barker was screaming loud enough to bring every patrol within 10 miles. Finch stared into the stove. He was asking for help. He was asking to hang us all. Miller moved away before guilt could take form in the room. He set his rifle against the altar and pulled a folded paper from inside his coat. The sheet was oil-stained and cracked along its creases. He spread it on the stone. "The bell was cast in Chihuahua in 1764, he said. "The account says the priest sealed 300 marks of crown silver inside the crown before the revolt, not beneath the floor, not behind the altar, inside the bell itself." Thorne looked upward. The darkness concealed the bells, but everyone in the room seemed to feel them. 300 marks? Finch asked. "Enough to buy land from here to the Texas line." "Paper says that?" "The man who sold it to me said that." Thorne barked a short laugh. "There's your proof." Miller seized the front of his coat. "You ate my food for 2 months. You fired my ammunition. You rode my horses. Don't grow honest now." Thorne shoved him away. Miller staggered, caught himself, and reached for his revolver. Finch stood quickly between them. "Not here," Finch said. "Not until we're warm." Miller's eyes went to the roof again. He lowered his hand. Taze touched Clara's sleeve and pointed to the whispering curve of the wall. Then he held up one finger. Not yet. The men stripped wet gloves and coats near the fire. Steam rose from the wool. The smell of unwashed bodies, horse sweat, and old grease spread through the sanctuary, overpowering the cedar. Thorne removed his boots and found blood in his socks. 2 toes were gray. He cursed Miller under his breath. Finch searched the pews for dry wood. He came close beneath the loft twice, but never looked up. Each time Clara pressed herself against the plaster until her injured shoulder throbbed. Miller began sounding the floor with the butt of his knife. He struck each flagstone, listening for hollowness, despite his claim that the treasure was overhead. His hunger could not permit any possibility to remain untested. At the base of the altar he found an old bronze candlestick. He rubbed it with his sleeve, saw that it was not gold, and threw it aside. It rolled across the floor and came to rest beneath a saint's empty niche. Taze's jaw tightened. Clara realized the mission was not merely useful ground to him. Every careless touch below was an insult. Yet he did not descend. He waited because anger served the thing it opposed if released too soon. The storm hammered the tower. Somewhere above, a bell yoke creaked. Finch looked up. "Hear that?" "Wind," Miller said. "Sounded like 'em up, and look." Finch did not move. Thorne wrapped his feet in strips cut from a saddle blanket. "Let the boy warm first." "Since when are you his mother?" "Since you forgot you were responsible for anybody but yourself." Miller turned on him. "I got you out of Fort Stanton. You got me into the guardhouse at Fort Stanton. You were stealing morphine. For my brother. Your brother died before you reached him." Thorne stood. His full height made Miller look suddenly slight. "Say one more word about him." Miller lifted his rifle. Taze moved his hand toward the revolver but did not draw. Finch stepped between the 2 men again, this time holding both palms up. "We need each other until daylight." "Get out of the way," Miller said. "No." The answer surprised all 3 men. Finch swallowed. "No. We came for the bell. We take the bell. Then you can kill each other somewhere I don't have to watch." Thorne sat down first. Miller lowered the rifle by inches. Fear had not made Finch weak, Clara understood. It had made him tired of stronger men deciding what he must endure. Miller folded the map and tucked it away. "At first light, we find the stair. Nanton comes between us and the bell. We put him down." "And if there's somebody else?" Finch asked. Miller looked toward the stove. Clara felt his suspicion move through the room like cold air. "The smoke began before the worst of the storm," he said. "Nanton wouldn't burn a fire bright enough to show unless he had reason." He walked slowly around the stove and crouched. On the stone lay one thread of dark green wool. Clara recognized it from her skirt. Miller picked it up. Taze's gaze shifted to her. No blame, only the recognition that their situation had changed. "A woman," Miller said. Finch gave a nervous laugh. "From one thread?" "Cavalry scouts don't wear green wool." Miller rubbed it between thumb and finger, and Nanton doesn't leave his fire to go cold unless he's hiding. He stood and raised his voice. "Ma'am, whoever you are, you're in poor company. Come down. We'll see you safe." Clara thought of Barker in the flooded shaft. Miller waited. Thorne looked uncomfortable. Maybe she went out. "In that?" Miller pointed toward the door. "No, she's here." He took the lantern from Finch, now burning with a weak yellow flame, and swept it along the walls. Light touched the lower edge of the choir screen but did not reveal the loft. "Come down," he called again. "You have my word." Taze leaned to Clara's ear. "His word kills." She nodded. Miller approached the altar. The lantern lifted. Light climbed the old plaster, found the first steps behind the side wall, and stopped. "There," he said. He signaled Finch to take one side and Thorne the other. Taze pointed toward the bell rope, then to Clara, and made the motion of a slow pull. Not yet a ring, only tension. He slipped behind a beam and vanished into the darkness at the rear of the loft. Miller placed one boot on the stair. Clara wrapped both hands around the rope. The hemp was rough and cold. Above her, several 100 pounds of bronze waited in silence. "Ma'am," Miller said as he climbed, "I would rather not shoot in a church." The lie carried through the gallery and returned from the opposite wall in a faint whisper. Clara saw how the curve caught it. She bent close to the plaster. In college, she had studied enough Latin to translate memorial inscriptions, though her pronunciation had never pleased Professor Bell. On the mission wall below, half hidden by soot, remained the fragment of a painted phrase. "Fat Justitia, let justice be done." Miller climbed another step. Clara placed her lips near the stone and whispered one word, "Justitia." The gallery took her voice. It traveled around the nave, thinned, deepened, and seemed to emerge from the wall behind Thorne. He spun so quickly that his bandaged feet slipped. What was that? Finch backed away from the altar. You heard it too? Miller stopped on the stair. The echo faded into the storm. No one moved. Tazazi's shadow crossed a gap in the screen at the far end of the loft, already changing position. Clara tightened her grip on the bell rope. Below, Silas Miller raised the lantern and resumed his climb. The stair was too narrow for Miller to climb with the rifle at his shoulder, so he held it upright beside his face and advanced one step at a time. The lantern in his other hand threw moving bars of light through the choir screen. Clara could see the ice melting from his coat and darkening the wood beneath him. Last chance, he said. Thorne had retreated to the stove. Finch stood near the aisle with his revolver drawn, turning at every small sound. The single whispered word had divided their attention more effectively than a gunshot. Miller reached the landing. He pushed the screen with his rifle barrel. Rotten wood flaked away. Clara pulled the rope just enough to take up its slack. High above, the great bell shifted in its cradle. The yoke gave a low wooden complaint. Finch gasped, "Silas!" Miller looked upward. Taizé dropped behind him. He had circled through the belfry stair and descended on the outer side of the landing. One hand closed around Miller's wrist. The other caught the rifle stock. Miller reacted with the speed of a man who had survived by expecting betrayal. He released the lantern and drove his elbow backward. Taizé turned with the blow. The lantern struck the stair and went out, plunging the loft into darkness. Wood thudded. A boot scraped. Miller cursed and fired. The muzzle flash filled the stairwell with a sheet of white-orange light. Clara saw Taizé twisted against the wall, Miller half kneeling, the rifle barrel pointed into the rafters. The bullet struck a beam. Dust and splinters rained down. Thorne shouted from below. Finch fired blindly toward the sound. His shot tore through the choir screen inches from Clara's shoulder. She dropped behind the stone lip, still holding the rope. Taizé wrenched the rifle free. Metal clattered down 3 steps. Miller seized the front of Taizé's shirt and drove him against the plaster. The old wall cracked. For a second, the 2 men were only shapes struggling in the dark breath and cloth and boots. Clara looped the short cord Taizé had prepared through the carved opening. Its loose end lay near the landing. She swung it low. The cord wrapped Miller's ankle. She pulled. Miller's foot flew backward. He crashed onto one knee. Taizé struck his forearm, and the revolver Miller had begun to draw fell through the stair opening to the nave below. Thorne reached it first. He picked it up and stared at the weapon in his hand. "Shoot him," Miller shouted. Thorne raised the revolver, but he did not aim at Taizé. He aimed toward the loft, uncertain where any body began in the darkness. "Which one?" "The Apache, you fool." Finch's voice cracked. "There's a woman up there. There is silver above us worth more than all our lives put together." Miller screamed, "Shoot!" That sentence settled the matter for Thorne. He lowered the gun. Miller tore his ankle free of the cord and lunged for Taizé's knife. Taizé trapped his wrist, but the 2 men slid toward the open edge of the loft. The old railing bent under their combined weight. Clara stood. She could not reach them. She could not safely descend. Finch still had a gun. Thorne had another, and Miller's violence was gathering force because every other form of control had failed him. Above, the great bronze bell waited. Clara wrapped the rope around her forearm and threw her full weight backward. The yoke turned. For one suspended instant, the bell's iron tongue traveled through darkness without sound. Then bronze struck bronze, and the mission woke. The first strike of the bell struck every body in the mission at once. The sound did not seem to travel through the air. It came through the stone, the stair, the railing, and the bones of Clara's hands. Dust burst from the rafters in a gray cloud. A flock of small bats tore loose from the darkness above the altar and wheeled blindly through the nave. Miller flinched. The old railing gave beneath his hip. For one terrible second he hung over the drop, one hand clawing at rotten wood. Taizé could have let him fall. The flagstones waited 20 feet below. Instead, Taizé caught the back of Miller's coat and hauled him inward. Miller repaid him by slashing with the knife he had stolen from Taizé's belt. The blade cut through Taizé's shirt and opened a line high on his shoulder. In the darkness it was impossible to see how deep the wound ran, but Clara heard the sharp release of his breath. Taizé struck Miller's wrist against the floor until the knife fell, then drove him face down and pinned his arm behind him. Clara pulled the rope again. The second toll was deeper. Snow that had accumulated on the roof slid in a heavy rush, roaring down the outer walls. The broken south door bowed inward under the sudden pressure. Finch fired at the bats. His bullet hit plaster, and a saint's remaining hand shattered from its niche. "Stop ringing it," he shouted. Clara found her footing and pulled a third time. The bell answered with a sound that filled all available space. Finch dropped his revolver and covered his ears. Thorne sank onto a pew, his face gray beneath the windburn. Miller fought against Taze's hold, but each movement became smaller as the bronze thunder rolled over him. 300 marks, Miller gasped. "It's in the crown. You ignorant savage, you don't even know what you're guarding." Taze tightened his grip but said nothing. Miller turned his head enough to see Clara. "He'll kill you when he's done with us. You think a fire changes what he is?" Clara's palms were raw against the rope. "A fire showed me what he is. You know nothing about him. I know he pulled you back from a fall you deserved." The words seemed to wound Miller more than Taze's knee between his shoulder blades. Below, Thorne rose with Miller's revolver still in his hand. He stared up through the broken screen. Clara could not read his expression. "Samuel," Miller called. His voice changed, becoming reasonable. "Shoot Nanton, we divide it 2 ways. Finch has no stomach for this." Finch looked at Thorne. "Don't. You think he'll spare you?" Miller continued. "You think the woman will tell a judge we came politely? There's a dead stage driver out there, maybe a wreck full of valuables. She can put every death on us." Clara understood the strategy. Miller was not offering Thorne wealth. He was building a fear large enough to make murder feel like self-defense. Thorne raised the revolver. Taze's body went still over Miller, waiting for the direction of the shot. Clara loosened one hand from the bell rope and stepped into the opening of the screen. The lantern below had gone out, but the stove fire gave enough light for Thorne to see her bandage and torn coat. "My driver's name was Elias Coe," she said. "He died when the coach overturned. None of you caused that." Thorne's arm wavered. "Miller will tell you that killing us is the only road left. It is not. Put the gun down." "You don't know what roads I got," Thorne said. "No, but I know this one ends with him leaving you behind." Miller laughed against the boards. "She's a schoolmarm, Thorne. Listen to her, and you'll hang with proper grammar." Thorne's eyes remained on Clara. "You said a judge. I said nothing about a judge. You will. If I live, I will tell the truth. That we broke in with rifles. Yes. That we came for the bell. Yes. That Finch fired. Yes, Finch closed his eyes," Clara continued. "I will also say that you did not fire when Miller ordered you to." Thorne looked at the revolver. He seemed to notice its weight for the first time. "What good does that do me?" "I don't know." The honesty halted him. Clara could have promised mercy, pardon, a new life, any of the bright lies people use when they need obedience. She had no authority to give those things. In a classroom, she could offer a child another chance at a sum. Here, she could offer only a true account of the choice being made. Thorne uncocked the revolver. Miller bucked so violently that Taze nearly lost his hold. "Cord!" Thorne looked toward the loft. "I've been called worse by better men." He set the revolver on the floor and kicked it beneath a pew. Finch's knees gave. He sat beside the stove and pressed both hands over his face. The immediate violence drained from the mission, but danger remained in every loose weapon and every man's exhaustion. Taze spoke to Clara without taking his eyes from Miller. "Cord." She brought the cut bell rope. Together they bound Miller's wrists behind him and looped a second length above his elbows. He cursed them steadily, conserving breath between insults. Taze searched him and found a derringer in his boot, 2 cartridges in a vest pocket, a folding razor, and the oil-stained map. When Taze unfolded the paper, Miller strained against the cord. "That belongs to me." Taze held it near the stove glow. The map was not an old mission record. Clara saw at once that the ink was recent. The Spanish handwriting at the top was copied badly, with several letters formed in the English style. A line drawing of the bell showed a hollow crown and a mark labeled Plata del Rey. Taze handed it to her. Clara read what she could. "This says the bell was cast to honor Saint Isabel and paid for with 300 marks of royal silver." Miller's face changed. She looked more closely. "Paid for with, not sealed inside." "You're reading it wrong? No, the priest's account? Who sold you this?" Miller's silence answered. Thorne came nearer. "Silas, it's a copy. The original was damaged." Clara held the page toward the fire, but not close enough to burn. "The lower note is in different ink. It says the bell contains the offering. That line was added later." Finch looked up. "By who?" Miller's jaw worked. Thorne gave a slow, empty laugh. "How much did you pay?" "That doesn't matter. How much?" $200. Finch removed his hands from his face. "You said you won it in a card game." I said what kept you moving. Thorn walked away, then turned and came back as if the nave were too small to contain his anger. Barker died for a paper you bought from a saloon liar. Barker died because Barker was weak. Thorn struck him. The punch knocked Miller sideways but could not drop him because Taze still held the cords. Blood appeared at Miller's lip. Taze stepped between them. Thorn's chest rose and fell. Move. Taze did not. He shot Barker. Taze's expression remained hard. Not here. The two words carried more command than Miller had managed all night. Thorn lowered his fist. Taze pointed to the stove. Sit. Perhaps it was the former scout's tone, perhaps the cold, perhaps the simple exhaustion of carrying rage too long. Thorn sat. Clara found the Derringer Finch had dropped and the carbine on the stair. She unloaded each weapon, placing cartridges in her satchel and guns near Taze. The act made her shoulder ache, but it gave her something exact to do. Miller watched. You have no idea what you're inviting. Nanton deserted federal service. There's a price on him. Taze tore a strip from Miller's coat lining and pressed it against the cut on his own shoulder. You worked with him, Clara said. Miller smiled. I commanded men like him. Taze's eyes met Clara's. No. Miller's smile faded. What happened? She asked. Taze did not answer immediately. He tightened the cloth around his shoulder with his teeth in one hand. Miller seemed eager to fill the silence. He led us to renegade camps, took cavalry pay. Then one morning he decided his loyalties had changed and vanished with 2 army horses. Taze said, 1 horse. You took a pack mule too. Mine. Thorn laughed despite himself. Miller leaned forward. Tell the schoolteacher what happened at Cañada Oscura. Tell her how many soldiers died because you warned the camp. Taze looked at the stove, at the red coals beneath the cedar. No camp. Miller's nostrils flared. Taze spoke slowly, assembling English from pieces he had not needed in years. Families, old, children, Captain said warriors. Miller showed trail, knew no warriors. Clara looked at Miller. They were supplying raiders. Children? Thorn asked. Do you want to count children every time a village feeds men with rifles? Taze's voice remained low. Captain ordered morning. I went night, told them go. So the patrol rode into an empty canyon and got fired on from the ridge. By warriors coming back. 6 soldiers died. Taze's gaze did not move. Families lived. Miller's face held an old hatred, personal and polished by repetition. He made fools of us. No, Clara said. You did that yourselves. The words left her before caution could stop them. Miller's eyes settled on her with such calm dislike that she felt colder than she had in the storm. You'll learn. He protects what he decides is innocent. The moment you stand between him and something he values, you become another kind of thing. Taze's hand moved, not toward a weapon, but toward the stove draft. He opened it. Flame rose and light spread across the room. Then why? Clara asked. Are you still alive? Miller had no answer. A heavy crack sounded from the south wall. Everyone turned. The broken door, braced with the pew, bent inward beneath the weight of drifted snow. Another crack followed. If the door failed, snow would pour into the nave and bury the stove. Worse, Finch's hoarse cry earlier suggested the animals were loose outside. Any surviving mount might be trapped against the wall. Taze pointed at Thorn Finch. Hold him. They looked at one another. Why should we help? Finch asked. Because cold does not ask who is guilty, Clara said. Thorn stood first. He took one of Miller's arms. After a moment, Finch took the other. Taze crossed to the south entrance. Clara followed with the lamp relit from the stove. The lower panel had bowed 6 inches. Powder hissed through the gaps. Taze examined the brace and shook his head. Need open, he said. If we open it, the drift comes in. He pointed upward, tracing an angle. They had to release the pressure before the wall or door collapsed, then clear the opening in stages. Clara looked at the men near the stove. Miller's face was pale now, that anger no longer warmed it. Thorn's damaged feet would not endure another hour without heat. Finch's hands had begun to tremble again. The mission had ceased to be a battlefield and become what it had been when Clara entered. A shelter that could fail if the people inside did not work. Taze handed her a shovel with half its handle missing. They lifted the brace. Snow exploded through the doorway. The drift entered waist-high and hard-packed at the bottom, loose as flour at the top. It knocked Clara backward. Taze caught her by the good arm, set her upright, and turned his shoulder against the white pressure. Push side, he said. They worked without grace. Clara drove the broken shovel into the snow and threw each load toward the wall. Taze cut a narrow channel with a flat altar board. Behind them, Thorne dragged Miller closer to the stove, while Finch piled ruined pews into a new barrier that funneled the incoming snow away from the fire. The cold returned at once. It licked under Clara's skirts and through the blanket around her shoulders. Meltwater ran down Taze's wounded arm, diluting the blood into pink tracks. After 10 minutes, they had opened a passage wide enough for one person. Taze crawled through first with a rope around his waist. Clara and Thorne held the other end. Outside, the storm had changed character. Snow still fell, but the wind came in lower, heavier gusts separated by strange pauses. During those pauses, Clara could hear the world settling, branches cracking, roof snow sliding, the small dry hiss of crystals moving over crust. Taze vanished around the corner. The rope tightened. Clara braced her boots. Thorne wrapped the line around his forearm. A horse screamed. Finch stumbled toward the opening. "That's my mare." "Stay back," Thorne said. "I know her voice." Another cry came from the north wall, weak and furious. Taze reappeared through blowing snow and motioned for more rope. Finch seized a second coil from the gear pile. "Let me go." Taze looked at his hands, his boots, then his face. Tie, Finch understood. He secured the rope around his chest while Taze tested the knot. The two men crawled outside together. Miller watched from the floor. Fools, risking themselves for horseflesh. Thorne kept one hand on the prisoner's cords. That mare carried Finch out of the arroyo when you left him. He fell behind. You cut his pack loose so yours would make the grade. Miller smiled faintly. And yet here he is. The rope jerked. Clara and Thorne hauled. Snow collapsed through the opening around Taze's legs. He crawled backward, guiding the line. Finch followed, one arm around the neck of a small dun mare whose front legs had broken through a crusted drift against the wall. The horse came in by force and terror. Her hooves struck the threshold. Her eyes rolled white. Finch spoke into her ear, repeating the same two words, "Easy, Blue, easy," until she stopped fighting long enough for Taze and Thorne to free her hind legs. They brought her into the side passage, not the nave, and blocked the broken doorway behind her with timber and packed snow. The mare stood trembling beneath the old sacristy arch. Steam rose from her coat. One knee was cut, but the leg held. Finch pressed his forehead to the white star between her eyes. "Thought you were gone," he whispered. The horse breathed against his chest. Clara saw Thorne look away. Taze rubbed the mare down with a torn altar cloth, then covered her back with Miller's greatcoat. Miller protested. "That coat is mine." No one answered him. The practical work continued. Finch melted snow and measured warm water into the horse's mouth with the tin cup. Thorne rebuilt the fire. Clara cut away Taze's torn shirt at the shoulder. The knife wound was shallow but long, crossing the upper muscle without entering the joint. Blood still welled when he moved. "Sit," she said. Taze glanced toward the doors. "I can bandage a cut while you listen." Perhaps he recognized his own earlier logic. He sat near the stove with his back to her. Clara cleaned the wound. He did not flinch until the warm water reached the deepest part. The muscles beneath his skin tightened like rope. "You may swear," she said. "I will not think less of you." He looked over his shoulder. "English or Apache?" She almost laughed. The sound surprised her. Small and rusty after the night they had endured. "Whichever is more useful." "Apache." He said something under his breath when she applied the pine salve. The tone conveyed enough. She bound the shoulder with linen from his pouch and reinforced it with a strip torn from her petticoat. Her stitches were not needed. The relief she felt at that was disproportionate. She had sewn skin only once, on her father's hand after a glass broke, and he had fainted while insisting he had not. Taze touched the cloth. "Good. It is ugly. Good can be ugly." Across the stove, Thorne stared into the flames. That may be the truest thing said in this church. Finch sat in the sacristy opening where he could see his mare. His revolver remained under the pew. He had made no effort to retrieve it. "What happens at daylight?" he asked. Clara looked at Taze. Taze looked at the gray windows. "Storm stops, road not open, I mean to us." Miller answered first. "He kills us or leaves us tied. The woman walks to San Aurelio and gives a heroic account. That is what happens." Clara tied off the bandage. "You seem very certain everyone behaves as you would." Miller ignored her. "Finch, your mare is alive. You could ride south when the wind drops. Untie me and we both leave. Blue can barely stand. She'll stand if you ask enough." Finch's face hardened. "That is how you treat everything." Miller leaned closer. "And it is why I am not the one shaking beside a horse." "No," Finch said. "You're the one tied on a church floor." Thorne gave a low grunt that might have been amusement. Clara moved toward the altar. where the forged map lay beneath a stone. She picked it up and studied the copied Spanish by the lamp. The document had been made by someone with enough knowledge to sound plausible and enough greed to understand the buyer. In the lower corner, nearly erased by oil, was a mark like two crossed nails. "Have you seen this sign?" she asked. Thorne glanced at it. "Pawn office in Santa Fe. Old Gutierrez uses it on receipts." Miller's eyes sharpened. "You bought this from a pawnbroker?" Finch asked. "Gutierrez had papers from a dead priest." "Gutierrez has papers from anybody who pays for them," Thorne said. "He sold me a land deed once. Covered 6 acres of the Rio Grande." Clara folded the map. "There was never treasure. There is bronze," Miller said. "Do you think the rail companies care whether silver is inside? Those bells are worth money." Taizé turned toward him. At last, stripped of the grand story, Miller had spoken the plain truth. He had come for whatever could be carried away. "You knew," Clara said. "I suspected. You let men die for a chance that the lie might be true. Men die for wages of $1 a day. Do not pretend risk is some sacred thing. Risk chosen with the truth is not the same as risk bought with a lie." Miller smiled through his split lip. "There is the schoolteacher." He shifted his bound hands beneath him. The movement was slight, but Taizé saw it. He crossed the space in 2 steps and pulled Miller's wrists into the light. A thin edge of metal lay between his fingers, the spring from the broken lantern sharpened against the floor. One strand of the rope had already been cut halfway through. Taizé took the metal. Thorne swore. "You are going to leave us here." Miller's expression remained calm. "I was going to improve my circumstances." Taizé rebound him with rawhide, wetting the knots so they would shrink as they dried. He secured Miller to the base of a stone column, far from loose debris. "You can't keep me here forever," Miller said. "No," Taizé replied, "only until truth comes." "What truth?" Taizé pointed toward the windows. Morning, the storm weakened by degrees. The pauses between gusts grew longer. Through the sacristy passage came the sound of Blue chewing a handful of damp grass Finch had found in a saddlebag. The domestic rhythm of the horse's teeth altered the room more than the bell had. It made the mission a stable, a kitchen, a shelter again. Clara sat with her back to the stove and closed her eyes for what she intended to be 1 minute. She woke to a hand over her mouth. Taizé crouched beside her, one finger raised. The fire had burned low. Thorne slept sitting against a pew. Finch was gone from the sacristy opening. Miller's column stood empty. The rawhide loop remained around its base, cut cleanly through. From above came the slow groan of the belfry stair. Taizé pointed to the sacristy. Clara moved there first. Blue stood with her head lowered. Finch lay behind her against the wall, one hand pressed to the side of his skull. Blood darkened his hair above the ear. His eyes opened when Clara touched his shoulder. "Miller," he whispered. Said the mare was down. I turned. "Did he take a weapon?" "Crowbar. My knife." Finch swallowed against nausea. He asked where the bell stair was. Thorne appeared behind them, limping and half awake. When he saw the empty column, sleep vanished from his face. "I'll go," he said. Taizé shook his head and pointed at Finch. "Stay, he'll tear the bell down. Stay." The command was not about trust. Thorne could barely walk, and the belfry stairs would turn his damaged feet into useless weight. He looked toward the dark tower, anger working in his jaw, then knelt beside Finch. Taizé began to climb. Clara followed. He turned on the 4th step and pointed downward. "No," she whispered. "You cannot pull the rope and fight him at the same time." His expression said that was precisely why she should remain below. "He is here because of the bell. I am here because you gave me a place beside the fire. I will not hide now." The stair creaked above them. Taizé yielded with obvious reluctance. He placed her behind him and continued upward. The choir loft was empty. Moonless gray light entered through the bullet holes in the screen. The heavy rope Clara had pulled hung motionless, its fibers still warm where they had burned her palms. A hatch stood open above. Taizé climbed through first. The belfry was a narrow chamber of beams, stone arches, and snow blown through open louvers. The 2 bells hung side by side. The larger one rose higher than a man's chest, its green-black surface marked by centuries of weather. Around its lip ran a Spanish inscription beneath a row of small cast flowers. The smaller bell faced east, cracked near the crown. Silas Miller stood on the outer frame with the crowbar wedged beneath an iron retaining strap. He had tied a rope from the bell yoke to a beam near the opening. If he broke the strap, the bell would not fall straight down into the nave. It would swing toward the west arch, strike the weakened stone, and perhaps tear free into the courtyard. Finch's knife lay open between his teeth while he worked. Taze stepped onto the platform. Miller froze, then pulled the knife from his mouth. "Stay back." Wind moved snow across the boards around his boots. Taze's hands remained empty. "You think this is sacred?" Miller said. "It was cast by men who came here with chains and priests. The people who made it stole the metal, stole the land, stole the labor. Now you guard it for them." Taze looked at the bell. "I guard what happened after." "What happened after?" Door opened. "To your mother?" Taze's eyes sharpened. Miller smiled. "You told that story when you were drinking at Sibique. A bell rang, monks fed your family, and now bronze is holy. Memory makes fools of men. Greed makes less." Miller shoved the crowbar downward. The iron strap groaned. Rust flaked off in red scales. Clara moved toward the large bell rope. Miller saw her. "Touch it and I cut the support. If you cut it, the bell may crush you. That concerns you? It concerns me that you mistake destruction for possession. Teacher's words." He pressed harder on the bar. "Here is a lesson. Nothing belongs to the dead unless the living are too frightened to take it. Your map was false. The bronze is not. You could have sought wages, land. Honest salvage from a place whose owners agreed." "Agreed?" Miller laughed. "Every acre from here to Boston sits beneath one man because another man stopped asking permission. Your father's books call it settlement when the winners do it slowly." Clara had no answer that could clean history. The mission itself stood upon layers of conquest. Taze knew it better than either of them. Miller mistook her silence for victory. "You see? We differ only in appetite." "No," Clara said. "We differ in what we do after we see the harm." The wind struck the tower. The smaller bell moved slightly and gave a thin, accidental note. Miller's eyes flicked toward it. Taze advanced. Miller swung the crowbar. Taze ducked, caught the iron shaft with both hands, and drove his shoulder into Miller's chest. They struck the bell. Bronze boomed at close range, a violent half-note that made Clara's vision jump. Miller kicked Taze's wounded shoulder. The bandage darkened instantly. Taze lost one hand from the bar. Clara pulled the bell rope. The great bell began to swing. Miller had tied his guide rope too close to the yoke. As the bell moved, the line tightened across the platform and caught him behind the knees. He fell hard. The crowbar slid toward the open arch. Taze lunged for Miller. Miller lunged for the crowbar. The bell struck. The sound inside the tower was beyond hearing. It erased thought. Snow burst inward from the arches. The guide rope snapped taut and yanked the weakened retaining strap. One iron bolt tore free of the beam with a shriek. The bell lurched sideways. Clara released the rope, but momentum carried the bronze. The entire frame shifted. A roof beam split above Taze. "Down," she shouted, though she could not hear herself. Taze dragged Miller toward the hatch. Miller fought him even as the tower groaned around them. He twisted free, seized the crowbar, and jammed it beneath the remaining strap. "If it falls," Clara said, "the west wall falls with it." Miller's lips formed words she could not hear. His face held the naked conviction that if he could not carry the bell, no one should keep it. He threw his weight on the bar. The second bolt began to rise. Taze crossed the platform, but falling plaster forced him back. Clara looked at the two ropes. The smaller bell's rope ran through a separate wheel and passed near the damaged frame. A counterpull might shift weight away from the west support if the old wheel held. She seized the smaller rope and wrapped it twice around a post. Taze saw what she intended. He caught the free end and pulled with his good arm. The small bell swung east. Its frame dragged against the shared crossbeam. The larger bell shifted half an inch in the opposite direction. The pressure on Miller's crowbar changed suddenly. Iron sprang free. The bar flew from his hands and struck the stone beside his head. Miller stumbled backward through the west arch. There was no floor behind him. His hands caught the sill. His body swung outside the tower above a courtyard filled with drifted snow and broken stone. The damaged support cracked again. Taze dropped flat and gripped Miller's wrist. For the second time that night, he held the life of the man who had tried to kill him. Miller stared upward, all arrogance gone. Snow gathered on his lashes. "Pull me in." Taze's wounded shoulder shook. Clara crawled beside him and caught Miller's other arm. Together they pulled. His coat scraped over the sill. One boot found the edge, slipped, and found it again. When at last he rolled onto the platform, he lay breathing in short animal gasps. Taze turned him over and bound his wrists with the remaining bell cord. Miller looked at him. "Why?" Taze tightened the knot. Door opened. The answer carried more than the story of his mother. A door once opened had become an obligation passed forward. Mercy was not innocence about what Miller had done. It was refusal to let him decide what kind of men the rest of them would become. The belfry still groaned. They had to move. Taze secured the damaged strap with the guide rope, lashing the bell yoke to the central beam. Clara looped the smaller bell rope through the opposite brace and pulled until the weight balanced. The repair would not survive another toll, but it held. They lowered Miller through the hatch first. Thorne received him at the loft and struck him once in the stomach before Taze could intervene. "That was for Finch," Thorne said. Miller folded around the blow, coughing. "And this," Thorne added, but Clara caught his arm. "One truth at a time," she said. He looked at her hand on his sleeve. Then he stepped away. Finch had managed to reach the nave. He sat by the stove with a wet cloth against his head. When Miller was brought down, Finch did not speak. His disappointment had passed beyond anger into a colder place. They tied Miller to a different column with 3 separate lengths of rope and removed his boot suits. Taze checked every seam. In the heel of the right boot, he found a tiny file, worn nearly flat. Thorne stared at it. "You had that the whole time." Miller said nothing. "You could have cut us loose at the guardhouse. You would have slowed me." Thorne sat beside Finch. No one defended Miller again. The tower settled by small degrees. Dusk continued to fall, but the beams held. Outside, the storm's long roar softened until individual sounds returned. Blue shifting her weight in the sacristy, water simmering on the stove, Finch breathing through his nose because his mouth had begun to swell from the cold. Clara's ears rang. Every voice sounded distant. Taze stood beneath the bells and listened through the stone. "Safe?" she asked. "For now." It was the only promise the mission had ever offered. They did not sleep again. There were too many injuries, too many damaged doors, and too little wood. Thorne's toes required slow warming. Clara remembered enough from a doctor's lecture never to rub frozen flesh, though Thorne begged her to because the returning pain felt like nails driven beneath his skin. She wrapped both feet in dry strips and placed them near, not against, the stove. Finch's head wound was ugly but shallow. His pupils matched, and he could tell Clara his name, the year, and the last town he remembered. When she asked who had struck him, he looked at Miller before answering. "The man I followed because I thought fear was the same as respect." Miller laughed once from the column. No one turned toward him. Taze's shoulder had opened again in the tower. Clara replaced the bandage while he sat facing the main doors. He let her work without protest, but the muscles along his back trembled with fatigue. Under the blood and weather scars, she saw the cost of his composure. Steadiness was not the absence of pain. It was pain given a task. When the dressing was secure, she poured him warm water. He drank and handed the cup back. "You pull hard. The bell?" He nodded. "My hands may never forgive me." He examined her blistered palms. From the wooden salve box, he took a softer ointment smelling of beeswax and cottonwood buds. He spread it over the burns with the back of a clean spoon. "Good can be ugly," Clara said. A quiet sound came from him, almost a laugh. The sky began to pale around 5 in the morning. The high windows changed from black to deep blue. Each minute revealed another part of the mission. The pale backs of ruined pews, Miller's coat over blue, the charcoal map smudged by boots, the broken saint's hand on the floor. Clara picked up the plaster hand and returned it to the niche. It would not stay. She set it at the saint's feet instead. Thorne watched her. "You Catholic? No, then why bother?" "Because Finch shot it, and Finch has enough to carry." Finch lowered his eyes. Thorne considered the answer. "You always talk like that? Only when I have not slept." This time all 3 unbound people smiled, including Finch. Miller tested his ropes and found no weakness. At first light, Taze climbed the tower alone. He returned with snow in his hair and reported that the eastern ridge was visible. The blizzard had passed south. The road remained buried, but the air had cleared enough to travel by landmarks. He drew a new route on the floor. A shallow arroyo ran from the mission toward San Aurelio. It would be filled with drifted snow in places, but its banks offered protection from the wind. The settlement lay 6 miles east, not the few miles Clara had imagined. With Thorne unable to walk and Finch's mare injured, they could not all reach it quickly. "We stay," Taze said. "One goes." "I will," Clara replied. Finch shook his head. "You nearly froze getting here. You have a head wound." "Thorne cannot put on a boot. Taze must keep the fire and watch Miller." "I can watch Miller," Thorne said. "You also want to kill him." Thorne glanced at the prisoner. "Less than before. That is not the same as no." Taze studied Clara's face. "Rode hard. So was the road here." He pointed to her shoulder. "It still works." He pointed to her boots, which were wet again around the soles. Clara looked down. Those may be an argument. Taze went to his gear and brought out a pair of soft hide moccasins lined with rabbit fur. They were too large, but he showed her how to wrap her feet in dry wool and tighten the uppers around her ankles. Over her coat he placed the heavy blanket that had remained in his pack, crossing it at her chest and securing it with a leather thong. He filled Elias's canteen with warm water, added a pinch of salt, and tucked it beneath the blanket so it would not freeze. Into her satchel he put jerky, matches, and a small packet of cedar shavings. Then he drew 3 marks on a scrap of wood: the mission, the split boulder near the arroyo, and San Aurelio's chapel cross. Beneath them he carved an arrow east. "You have done this before," Clara said. Taze touched the mission mark. "People come lost. How many?" He shrugged. Numbers did not seem important to him. Miller spoke from the column. "Send her alone and you may as well bury her now." Taze did not look at him. "I know the road," Miller continued. "Untie my feet. Keep my hands bound. I can guide her." "No," Clara and Taze said together. Miller leaned his head back against the stone. "Then perhaps you deserve each other." Clara checked the cartridges in her satchel, not because she intended to use them, but because leaving them near Miller would be foolish. She carried no loaded gun. Taze offered his revolver. She declined. "I have fired one twice," she said. "Both times I closed my eyes." He considered this and handed her a short walking staff instead. One end was hardened by fire, the other wrapped in leather. At the door, Finch caught her sleeve. "Tell them I came in with Miller. Don't change that." "I will tell them." "Tell them I fired in the church." "Yes." He swallowed. "Tell them I put the gun down." "I will." Thorne said, "Tell them my name is Samuel Thorne, not Sam Miller's man." Clara nodded. Miller's voice followed her. "And what will you tell them about Nanton?" The room became quiet. A federal warrant might indeed exist. Taze had deserted as a scout. A report placing him at the mission could bring soldiers, trackers, or men eager for reward. Yet omitting him would turn truth into another tool shaped for convenience. Clara looked at Taze. He gave no instruction. "I will tell them a man saved my life," she said. "What name belongs in that account will be his choice." Taze's eyes held hers. Then he nodded once. They opened the main doors. The courtyard had become a white basin beneath a blue-black morning. Snow covered the low walls and rounded the fallen stones. The sky in the east showed a narrow band of rose. Air entered Clara's lungs like clean glass. Taze walked with her to the edge of the mission grounds. He tested the crust with his staff and chose places where the snow held. Beyond the outer wall, they found the first sign of the men's arrival, a saddle half buried near a juniper, its stirrup leather whipping in the remaining wind. Farther down the slope lay Finch's second pack and a dead horse under a smooth white mound. Taze paused. He touched 2 fingers to the snow and moved on. At the ravine, Clara saw the wrecked stage. The storm had nearly buried it. One rear wheel and part of the red-painted body remained visible. Elias lay where she had left him, but snow had covered everything except one glove holding the broken rein. Clara stopped. Taze removed his hat. They dug with the shovel in their hands until Elias's face was clear. The cold had preserved the stern set of his features, but with his eyes closed he looked less defeated than tired. Taze found flat stones along the ravine wall and built a low cairn around the body. Clara recovered the scattered mail she could see. Most envelopes were soaked. She placed them inside the stage compartment, then found the page from Plutarch still tucked in her coat. She read the surviving line. It spoke of courage as knowledge of what need not be feared. The sentence felt too polished for the place. Clara folded the page and placed it beneath one of the stones near Elias's hand. "He said history was mostly weather and men claiming they planned for it," she told Taze. Taze looked at the buried road. Wise. He would have enjoyed hearing that. They stood until the light strengthened. At the mouth of the arroyo, Taze stopped. Beyond that point, the route ran east between low banks and could be followed without him. The mission remained visible behind them, its cross dark against the whitening sky. "You are not coming farther," Clara said. It was not a question. Taze pointed back toward the church. "Bell hurt the frame." He nodded. "Men hurt? Horse. Miller." His expression suggested Miller belonged low on the list but remained on it. Clara looked east. 6 miles of snow lay between her and the settlement. Then she looked at the man beside her, whose fire had changed the measure by which she judged safety. "What will you do when people come?" "Leave before soldiers." "And the bells?" "Fix, then leave." She wanted to ask where he went when he disappeared from maps. She wanted to ask whether the mission was his home, whether any person waited for him, whether he expected to spend every winter guarding memories that could not answer. Those questions would have been attempts to fit him into a story she understood. Instead, she held out Elias's canteen. "You gave this to me." Taze pushed it back toward her. Ko gave. He did not know he was giving it. Many gifts like that. Clara slipped the strap over her shoulder. "Will I see you again?" Taze considered the arroyo, the mission, and the country beyond both. Maybe. It was not a promise. She trusted it more for that. She touched 2 fingers to her forehead, repeating the gesture he had made for Elias. Taze responded in kind. Then Clara turned east. The walking was slow but not desperate. The storm had hardened the upper snow into a crust that sometimes held and sometimes broke beneath her. Each collapse jarred her shoulder. She used the staff to test the ground. At the split boulder, she found Taze's second mark scratched into the sheltered side, old enough to have guided other travelers before her. The sun cleared the ridge. Light spilled across the snow, gold at first, then white so bright that Clara narrowed her eyes. Behind her, the bells remained silent. She imagined Taze climbing among the beams, tightening ropes, correcting the damage their survival had caused. Near midday, she heard a dog bark. The sound was so ordinary that she doubted it. Then came another bark, closer, followed by a man's shout in Spanish. 2 riders appeared above the arroyo bank. One wore a sheepskin coat and carried a coil of rope. The other was a teenage boy on a gray mule. Their faces changed when they saw Clara walking alone in oversized moccasins with a blood-stained bandage around her head. The older rider dismounted. "Senora, where did you come from?" "Santa Ysabel." He crossed himself. "The mission, yes. There are injured men there. 4 men and a horse." "4?" Clara corrected herself. 3 men who broke in and 1 who kept them alive. The rider looked past her toward the western ridge, but the mission was hidden by the bend. He gave her water, though she still had some, and lifted her onto his horse. The boy rode ahead to San Aurelio while the older man supported Clara with one arm and asked no more questions. The settlement appeared in stages: chimney smoke, cottonwoods stripped bare, a low adobe chapel, and finally the schoolhouse with its roof patched in flattened kerosene tins. The east window stood open a few inches. Smoke curled from the stovepipe exactly as the widow Ortega had warned. People came running. Clara remembered being carried into a kitchen bright with copper pots. She remembered the smell of beans, wood smoke, and bread. Someone cut the ruined boot wrappings from her feet. A woman with silver hair pressed a warm cloth to her face and said, "You are the teacher," not as a question but as recognition of an overdue parcel. Clara caught her wrist. "Send men to the mission." "We will, now, the drifts. There is a man with frozen feet. Another has a head wound. An Apache man is bleeding from the shoulder." She heard the room become still at the word Apache. "He saved all of us, including the man who stabbed him." The widow Ortega's eyes remained on Clara's face. "What is his name?" Clara remembered her answer to Miller. He called himself Taze Nantan. The widow repeated the name softly. Recognition passed through her expression. "My grandfather spoke of him," she said. "A scout who brought children through the Black Canyon. Then send men who know the difference between a rescuer and a reward." The widow turned to her eldest son. "Take Mateo, Luis, and the big sled. No rifles unless they stay wrapped. Bring blankets, bring the doctor." Clara finally allowed herself to lie down. She slept for 14 hours. When she woke, rain tapped the roof. The freak cold had broken, and water ran from the eaves in steady streams. Her shoulder had been strapped, her feet wrapped, and her temple stitched with 4 black knots. The widow Ortega sat by the bed mending a child's shirt. "The men returned," she said. Clara pushed herself upright. "All of them?" 3 prisoners, 1 angry horse, no Apache. Of course the bell, still hanging. 1 support newly lashed with rawhide better than any carpenter in town could do. "And Elias Coe? They brought him too." Clara closed her eyes. The widow set down the shirt. "Silas Miller says an Indian attacked him and held him for sacrifice. That is a lie. I assumed so when Samuel Thorne told the Deputy Miller tried to pull the bell through the wall. Thorne spoke, and Joseph Finch, separately. Their stories agree in all the places that matter." Clara looked toward the open east window. The school stove smoked faintly, and the room smelled of damp adobe. "What will happen to them?" "Miller will be taken to Santa Fe when the road opens. Thorne and Finch too, though the deputy says their choices in the church may be remembered." The exact future remained beyond Clara's authority, as it had in the mission. She could only give the account she had promised. 3 days later, She stood before the deputy with bandaged hands and told the story from the station office to the dawn. She did not decorate Taze's mercy or soften Miller's actions. She included Finch's shot, Thorne's lowered gun, Elias's death, the false map, and the 2 times Taze had pulled Miller away from a fatal fall. When the deputy asked whether Taze Nantan had threatened her, Clara said, "Only with dry socks, food, and an insistence that I remain alive." The clerk tried not to smile as he wrote. Winter settled more normally after that. Clara opened the school with 17 students, then 23. The stove smoked whenever the wind came from the west. She learned to open the east window before lighting it. She learned which children could read in Spanish, but pretended they could not read at all because English embarrassed them. She learned that hunger looked like sleepiness before noon and kept a pot of beans warming behind the stove. On the wall above her desk, she hung no heroic painting. She placed the scorched scrap of wood on which Taze had carved the route from Santa Isabel to San Aurelio. In January, a territorial official sent notice that the mission bells were to be inventoried for removal and preservation in Santa Fe. Clara wrote back that the road was impassable. In March, he wrote again. She answered with a petition signed by every family in San Aurelio and by the priest from 3 valleys south, declaring the mission an emergency shelter and the bells necessary for signaling during storms. The official demanded evidence that the bells had ever served such a purpose. Clara sent sworn statements from Thorne, Finch, the rescue party, and herself. She did not claim ownership for Taze. She wrote only that a local guardian had maintained the stove, stored dry cedar, marked the eastern route, and saved travelers without compensation. The official could not inventory a man described without rank, address, or taxable property. The removal order disappeared into a file. By spring, Samuel Thorne had accepted a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony about Miller's earlier crimes. Joseph Finch was sent to a work crew near Albuquerque. He wrote once to say that Blue had been returned to him and that he intended, when free, to go north where no one knew Miller's name. Clara answered with 1 page. She reminded him that putting down a gun did not erase firing it, but it changed the next thing that became possible. Silas Miller was convicted of desertion, theft, assault, and the killing of Barker at Cibola. He insisted to the end that Silva remained inside the bell. In May, Clara rode to Santa Isabel with the widow Ortega's eldest son and 2 students old enough to handle horses. Wildflowers had appeared along the arroyo. The mission stood pale against red earth, its courtyard alive with lizards and wind-blown grass. The south door had been repaired. A stack of cedar waited beside the stove. The charcoal map had been washed from the floor, but near the pillar Clara found a new mark cut into the stone, a small flame beneath an open door. Taze was gone. She climbed the belfry. The large bell hung straight. Its repaired strap had been replaced with forged iron, dark and clean against the old beam. Around the lip she read the full inscription for the first time. It did not speak of treasure. It asked that the voice of the bell guide the lost and gather the living. Clara placed 1 hand on the cold bronze. She did not ring it. Below, her students called to one another as they swept debris from the nave. A broom scratched over stone. Someone laughed near the stove. The ordinary sounds rose into the tower and entered the bell's hollow body, where they gathered without being made into anything grander than they were. Clara thought of the night she had entered. Believing sanctuary was a place found by luck. She understood now that shelter was an action. Someone cut wood before the storm. Someone kept matches dry. Someone opened a door despite history, danger, and every reason not to trust the person outside. On the ride back to San Aurelio, she looked west once from the split boulder. A dark figure stood on a distant ridge beside a gray horse. The distance was too great to see a face. The figure raised 1 hand, Clara raised hers. Then the horse turned, and both disappeared into the folds of the high desert. She continued east with the carved route in her pocket, Elias's canteen at her saddle, and the knowledge that dignity was not something another person could bestow. It was the small fire one tended in another's worst hour, the hand that pulled an enemy from a fall, the truth told without promise of reward. Behind her, the bells of Santa Isabel remained silent in the afternoon light. They did not need to ring for her to hear them.